Matthew chapter 13, and today we're going to be reading verses 51 and 52. We're going to skip just a couple of the parables because there's another insight that we get regarding the parables in chapter 13. 7 parables about the kingdom of heaven, and there's another little clue that helps us understand what these parables are all about, and we get it in verses 51 and 52. So let's read that together. Verse 51, have you understood all of these things? This is Jesus speaking after he's finished the 7 parables. And they said to him, yes. And he said to them, therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. I want to draw your attention to that word therefore. I would put a square around that, a very important word in the text. Anytime you see a therefore in the text, you want to ask yourself, what is the therefore? The therefore is there because Jesus is saying, now that I've covered these 7 parables, now that I've told you these sayings about the kingdom of heaven, which all of Israel has been waiting for, now that I've told you secrets about the kingdom of heaven, these things that have been hidden from the wise and the learned, but they're being revealed to the children. Now that I've finished saying these things, therefore, he's going to sum up what all of this is supposed to have taught them. And what this is supposed to have taught them is that from now on, in the kingdom of heaven, as we go forward, he's letting his disciples know we're going to use some of what was old, but we're going to also be using what is new. That was the point of the parables, to reveal a new truth. That there is something new that Jesus is unrolling, something new that the apostles will continue to unroll for us, but that the nature of the kingdom of heaven is going to involve some of the old, which was the Mosaic covenant, what we call the Old Testament, and it is also going to involve some new things. And what's important about that is if entering into this kingdom of heaven is going to involve also new things that him and the apostles will be teaching us, then what does that mean for those that are rejecting the teachings of the Messiah? So this concludes 2 insights into the parables. The first insight we did a few weeks ago, verses 10 through 17, is what he said. The purpose of parables, the purpose of speaking this way, is to hide the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven from some people. But the parable will also reveal these mysteries to the children whom God wanted them to be revealed to. Today we get a second insight, and the second insight about these parables is that Jesus is revealing new information, and that when someone becomes trained in the things of the kingdom, when someone becomes trained in the inauguration of this kingdom that Jesus is beginning and that his apostles will continue to explain to us. Once you get trained in that, the nature of the kingdom is that we're going to be including both old stuff and new stuff. In case you're unfamiliar with the Jewish expectation of a kingdom, all throughout the Old Testament, God had been promising to the Jewish nation for their obedience, which never came about. Even up to the days of John the Baptist and Jesus, the Jews did not bear fruit, and they remained rebellious and disobedient. We'll remember Jesus said, this is an evil and an adulterous generation. But what they had been told in the Old Testament is that someday there was hope that God would reestablish Jerusalem, reestablish the Jewish nation, give them a king that would reign on earth, do away with all of their enemies, and they would reign on earth for eternity. Those were Old Testament promises. But Jesus is saying, in addition to everything that you've heard, in addition to the king like David that would reign on earth, in addition to the restoration of Israel as a nation, what Jesus says is, I've come to tell you there's some new information for you. In some ways, we're going to find out that the new information that Jesus has revealed through those 7 parables, in some ways, it's going to harmonize with the original idea of the kingdom expectation. But in some ways, the new stuff that Jesus is revealing, in some ways, the new stuff is going to break with the old expectation, and it's going to reveal something new. Just in case you're curious about this, the idea that God would issue in new information about the kingdom of heaven, differing from the plan that was revealed in the Old Testament, just so you know, this concept of the kingdom of heaven was revealed in the book of Isaiah from chapter 40 to chapter 55. If somebody was to read through that section, dedicate yourself for a few weeks or a few months, Isaiah chapter 40 through Isaiah chapter 55, you would see this long plan of God to institute His kingdom. But somewhere around verse 49, you would also recognize that God says, but then I'm going to do something new that you never would have seen coming. As we move on through the chapters, you get into the chapters 50, 51, 2, and 3, you realize God's going to raise up a brand new servant because Israel has failed to glorify God. So God raises up a new servant who will glorify Him. And then in 52 and 53, it says, but you're going to pull the hair out of His beard. You're going to spit on His face. He's going to be pierced for our transgressions. And this was the new thing that beginning in chapter 49, God was saying, if things are going to take a twist and you're not going to see it coming. Let me just take you back to that just so you can see it. It's actually in Isaiah chapter 48. Chapter 48 and verse 6, from this time forth I announce to you new things, hidden things that you have not known. They are created now, not long ago. Before today, you have never heard of them. Lest you should say, behold, I already knew about them. So that's just a little part of it. Let me bring you back into the context of Matthew 13. Jesus has been preaching. Jesus has been revealing things. And I want you to hear what all the people are saying about the things that Jesus is teaching. Turn with me to Mark chapter 1. Mark chapter 1 and verse 27. Look at what the people say about Jesus' teaching. Verse 27, and they were all amazed, so that they questioned amongst themselves, saying, what is this? A new teaching with authority. And He commands even unclean spirits, and even they obey Him. What is going on? The wind and the waves obey Him. The demons obey Him. The unclean spirits obey Him. And what is this new teaching that He is giving to us? That is the fulfillment of Isaiah 48, and it's beginning what was promised from Isaiah 48 all the way through 53. Jesus is now doing it. It's something that had been announced long ago. But just as a reminder for our context, not everybody liked the message that Jesus was delivering, because the new message that Jesus was delivering was suggesting that the scribes and the Pharisees, the spiritual leaders of the day, were no longer going to have a job in this new kingdom. And of course, if you're a scribe or a Pharisee, that's going to bother you just a little bit. So what did the scribes and the Pharisees want to do as a result of Jesus' preaching that sounds like, we're not going to be using you in the new kingdom? The temple rituals, the temple sacrifices, the Jewish high priests and the Jewish priesthood, none of that is going to be used in the new kingdom. Well, how would they have responded to that? Mark tells us, Mark chapter 11 and verse 18. And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and they were seeking for a way to destroy him because they feared him. Because all the crowd was astonished by his what? By this teaching. This new thing that's coming from his lips. And it's precisely because they wanted to kill him that Jesus knew the truth about the kingdom needs to be hidden from some people. But it is getting revealed to other people. And so our text today says, if you're going to be a scribe in the kingdom of heaven, in this new era that Jesus is ushering in, you're going to have to get used to the idea that you're going to be teaching some of the old stuff, but you're also going to be teaching this new stuff. That's the whole point of our therefore text today. Let me kind of give you a couple ways to take this in. Let me read what a couple different theologians have written about this text, about the idea of teaching both old and new. The first one here, the key here, indeed the key to the parables themselves, is the combination of new and old. The Christian scribe who is trained in the kingdom and prepared to teach others must be able to use old and new together to bring clarity and understanding to the message of the kingdom in its application to the present. The old things and the new things of the Christian scribe are both indispensable to the gospel. If I continue on with Hagner, he says, the Christian Torah scribe, scholar or scribe, is one who is trained in the mysteries of the kingdom, who's able to maintain a balance between the continuity and the discontinuity existing between the era inaugurated by Jesus and that of the past. Every Christian must bring out of his or her storeroom both old things and new things. For example, he must represent a Christianity that encompasses both testaments. So fundamentally, what Jesus is saying is, in this new kingdom that he is ushering in, we're still going to study and be aware and use the Mosaic information, the Old Testament information. However, Jesus says, but I am ushering in brand new information, which we're going to call the New Testament. And in the kingdom of heaven, both of them are going to need to be used in order to adequately train us regarding this promise of this kingdom that God would establish one day. Let me put a pin in the sermon right there, because if you haven't already picked up on this, even amongst in our own time, have you ever heard people talk about this idea that the God of the... oh, thank you, Ron. Yeah, I'm done. If you've ever heard the discussion, sometimes people get the feeling that the God of the Old Testament was mean and angry, and the God of the New Testament is compassionate and loving and forgiving. And there's this sense of two different gods. And sometimes people want to go in the New Testament, under the New Covenant, it's a different God. He's not like that Old Testament God. You've heard that discussion. And people always wonder, did God change? Is God different now? Well, this is not a new question, you guys. There is, in about 135 AD, so 135, that's, roughly, let's say, 100 years after Jesus' crucifixion, there was already this guy named Marcion, and he came up with one of the earliest heresies, Marcionism. And let me just read you the definition. Marcionism believed that the benevolent God of the New Testament was not the same angry Hebrew God of the Old Testament. And so one of the first heresies was this guy was saying, we don't go by the Old Testament. That Hebrew God was an angry God. We don't use that stuff. We only use the New Testament, this benevolent, loving, grace-filled God. We ignore that old one and we only use this new one. So that's Marcionism. We don't like the Old Testament. We don't like the God of the Old Testament. We don't want to use that because the benevolent God of the New Testament is a completely different God. Now, we haven't gone quite that far, but there are people that kind of don't want too much of the Old Testament because we don't like that idea of God. And what Jesus is saying is exactly the opposite of that. What Jesus is saying by the scribe, the teacher, the theologian, the biblical student in the new era is going to use both. Because there's a harmony between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The gospel extends all the way from Genesis 1 or 3 there. He will bruise your heel and you will crush his head. There'll be enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. That whole battle is already revealing the gospel. And so what Jesus is saying is, no, there is one gospel, there is one message that involves going through the entire Old Testament, all the way through the New Testament. That gospel is one continuous, harmonious story. And, however, Jesus and the apostles will institute some new teachings that will supersede some of the old teachings. New teachings that will override or take precedence over some of those old teachings. So in one sense, you're going to have harmony and continuity between Old and New Testaments. But in another sense, you're also going to have a rift or a break because Jesus and the apostles will reveal new things to us. So there's going to be a tension. There's going to be a tension, but Jesus says the good teacher will learn how to balance out that tension. So now you know a little bit about Marcionism. Let me give you one other quote here. The crypto-Marcionites in our midst who treat the Old Testament as superfluous need to be reminded that what God was doing in Jesus was merely a continuation of the grand story that began with creation. To ignore the Old Testament is to truncate the gospel. What does that mean, to truncate the gospel? To ignore the Old Testament is to cut in half, is to shorten the true message of the gospel. If you don't want to study that old stuff, if the churches want to stay away from that first half of the Bible, don't preach it, don't study it, let's not bring it up. He says, then what you've done is you've truncated the gospel. You're missing a large portion of the gospel that began in the book of Genesis. So we don't want to do that. Let me put a pin in the sermon for just a minute. I can't help but bring up one modern thing that we should be aware of. It's this theology called dispensationalism. Has anybody ever heard the word dispensationalism? What is that? Dispensationalism is the belief, and it's big, I'm just going to really quick, is that God still needs to keep the promises to the Jews. Which means, coming out of the Old Testament, God still needs to give them Jerusalem back. God still needs to rebuild the temple. God still needs to reinstill the sacrifices. And He needs to create the literal Jerusalem back in Jerusalem. He still has to keep that promise. They're waiting for that. That's going to be the age of the kingdom. But Jesus says, if I'm casting out demons, then that means the kingdom has already come upon you. So it's here, He said, the kingdom doesn't come on. And that is exactly the purpose of Matthew chapter 13. In those 7 parables, Jesus is explaining by way of mystery that the kingdom is already here, and it does not look the way the Old Testament said it would look. Why not? Because Jesus is teaching us something new. And that's one of the biggest problems, I think, is having missed the secrets revealed in Matthew 13 through those 7 parables. People have missed that the idea of the kingdom looks different than what was presented in the Old Testament promises. That's the purpose of the parables. So they've missed it, and they said, okay, so God still has to keep that promise. That's going to happen sometime in the future. But Jesus is saying, no, that kingdom is here. He said, I came to bind up the strong man, because how can I steal the strong man's possessions unless I first bind up the strong man? So the kingdom is here. Jesus has inaugurated it, but the parables are teaching us that there is something that has been hidden from certain eyes and revealed to other eyes. Let me go back. We've only looked at one of the parables so far, the parable of the sower. Let me show you how the parables are teaching us something new. In the old law, the idea of God establishing His kingdom for Israel had to do with the corporate Israel. The entire nation of Israel was going to be brought into this kingdom, a corporate promise. But what we learn by the parable of the sower is that Israel is like 4 different soils. 3 of the soils do not bear any fruit. But one of the soils did bear fruit, bore a lot of fruit. What does that parable mean? It means that Israel has lost its tenure. God no longer deals with the promises to the corporate idea of Israel, the nation of Israel, but rather only the part of Israel that is good soil, only the part that bears fruit. So now God's promises of entering the kingdom are individual, personal promises to people who will bear fruit. What happens to all those soils that did not bear fruit? Well, that was John the Baptist's message. The axe is already laid at the root of the tree. Any tree that does not bear good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. So that's what the parable of the sower was to teach us, that the promises are now individual. Let me give you that verse, Matthew chapter 7 and verse 19. Here's how things are going forward in the kingdom. No longer a corporate promise, but an individual promise. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 19. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruit. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. This is the new teaching. With all that understanding, why don't we quickly look at two more of the parables? There's 7. That was the first one, the sower. We covered that last week. Let's look at 2 quick ones. Matthew 13, let's go to 44 and 45. These are very short, and they both illustrate the same point. And so we'll get 2 more of them under our belt. And we're looking for this new revelation of the kingdom. So, Matthew 13 and verse 44, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure that was hidden in a field, which a man found and then covered up. And then in his joy, he goes and he sells all that he has, and he buys that field. The second parable is just very like it, 45 and 46 here. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who, when he finds a pearl of great value, goes and sells everything he has so that he can buy this new thing. I'd probably put a square around sold all that he had. You got it in verse 44. He sold all that he had. You got it in verse 46. Sold all that he had. That parable is a mystery. Some people, it is hidden from some people and they won't get to see it. It is revealed to the children so that they can see it. And it tells you something new about this kingdom that has been promised from the days of old. What does it look like to you? The kingdom is like someone who found something new. And this new thing was so awesome and so precious, so wonderful, that he turns around and gets rid of everything he had been accumulating up to that point in his life. Can you see what he's talking about? A faithful Jew, faithful to the Mosaic law, the Mosaic covenant, the covenant of circumcision, the washing of hands, the eating of certain foods, the rituals at the temple, that which him and his ancestors have been doing for decades, and he finds something brand new, and the new thing that he finds makes him want to give up all of the old stuff in order to be able to embrace the glory of this new thing. Are you getting it? What he's telling the Jewish people is, when you see the truth that I am revealing to you about the kingdom of heaven, that which God is establishing on earth with the inauguration of Jesus, when you see the truth of how this is going to take place, you have no problem letting go of the Mosaic law. You have no problem letting go of your heritage, your tradition, your background, everything that you've been familiar with in the past. You gladly let go of all of that in order to embrace this new thing. The new thing would be the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the apostles, which in some ways will harmonize with all the old stuff that you are familiar with. But in a lot of ways, it's going to change the old mindsets, and it's going to be something new and different. You're going to have to be willing to let go of the old in order to be able to embrace the new. That's the secret hidden message to Israel revealed in those 2 parables. Let me give you some scriptural illustrations about the idea of needing to let go of something old because Jesus has called us to embrace something new. Let me take you through a couple scriptures that make this obvious. The first one is going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, we'll start in verse 6. And Paul makes this transition very, very obvious. Verse 6. Who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant. Put a square around new. Not the letter, which was the Mosaic law, but the Spirit, which is Jesus and the Apostles' law. Because the letter, that old Mosaic law, kills, but the Spirit, the new covenant, gives life. Now, if the ministry of death, which was carved in letters on stone, came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of the glory which was being brought to an end. Put a square around the word end. Verse 8. Will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, then the ministry of righteousness must far exceed it in glory. Indeed, in this case, what once had glory has come to have no glory at all because of the glory that has surpassed it. For if what was being brought to an end, put a square around end, if what was being brought to an end came with glory, how much more will what is permanent have glory? Paul says we've got to make a transition. We've got to embrace something new. It's not to diminish the Old Testament. It's not to diminish the laws of God. He says those were glorious. They reveal the will of God to us. Those had a glory. But in Christ and His atonement for sin, in that atonement for sin, not talking about the goats and the blood of goats and sheep as an atonement, but now we're talking about the blood of Christ as an atonement. He says because of how beautiful and glorious that message is, we got to leave behind the old message, which is fading away. It no longer has a glory in comparison to the new message, the glory of the new message. Let me give you one more text. Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 13. Hebrews 8 and verse 13. By speaking of a new covenant, He has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear. I should have done my homework. I don't know when Hebrews was written. I should have looked it up, but I'm sure it was before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. When he says it's old and obsolete and it's aging and it will soon disappear, right there next to that word disappear, I would write the words AD 70. 70 AD. Rome comes. The scribes and the Pharisees and the spiritual leadership of Israel ignored Jesus' message, ignored John the Baptist's message of repenting. Therefore, the prophecy that any tree that did not bear good fruit would be cut down came true in 70 AD when Rome comes, surrounds Jerusalem, breaks down the walls of Jerusalem, destroys the temple, sets it on fire, destroys the priesthood, destroys the Torah, destroys the sacrifices. Nothing is left that would allow Israel to practice that old style religion. God took it away, abolished it so that it could never be practiced again. Do you know there were some 613 commandments in the law of Moses, rules that Israel had to obey? A great number of those rules involved going to Jerusalem. A great number of those rules involved the temple. A great number of those rules involved the sacrifices and the feasts and the festivals. And with the destruction of Jerusalem, God did away with those. They said if you were to try to keep the Torah today, at best you would only be able to keep about 300 of the laws. Because the other 313, you can't do them anymore. God did away with that system. So what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear, and it did. Jesus and the apostles ushered in a new teaching. Some resonate with the old teachings. Some actually supersede the old teachings. And so what we've learned, we've got 3 of the 7 parables so far. What we learned in the first parable, the sower of the seed, is that this is no longer a corporate promise, a national promise to Israel. This is an individual promise. And Isaiah revealed that the promise is not limited to Israel anymore, but it extends to every nation, every tribe, every language and tongue, to the ends of the earth. So the invitation to enter into the kingdom of heaven is to anyone of any tribe, nation, language, and tongue who would receive the gospel, repent of their former life, and begin to bear fruit. You are the members of the kingdom of heaven. That was what the first one revealed. What was revealed today is that people are going to need to be aware that you're going to need to be willing to give up the old. Leave behind the old. Trade in and sell everything that you believed up to the point that you met Jesus. Trade all of that in for this new, beautiful pearl of great price. This new, wonderful treasure that you found. This new teaching by Jesus and the apostles that has a glory that is so awesome that it makes the glory of the Old Testament pale by comparison. The blood of Christ versus the blood of bulls and goats. Having said that, he said, though, that as we engage in this new thing, the job in the kingdom is to preserve and bring out of the storehouse some of the old and all of this new. To give you an example of how we do that, even the apostles would say, "It is written." What did it mean when Jesus said, "It is written"? When the apostles would say, "It is written," this happened to fulfill what was said by the prophets. Jesus fulfilled everything in the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. What are all those references? All of those references are New Testament foundational teachers going back and teaching us stuff from the Old Testament. Because that's where it is written. So, if anybody ever wondered, do we still want to study the Old Testament? Do we believe in the God of the Old Testament? The answer has got to be, of course. There is both a harmony and sometimes a discontinuity between both. The job of the New Testament scribe, the theologian, the person who studies the Bible, your job, the job of this pulpit and the job of our Bible school classrooms is to reveal both the old and the new.